Many thanks to Squarespace for sponsoring this week's video. It's interesting, I always return home from teaching workshops with a boatload of great video ideas, mainly because during these workshops, well, these are real-world, on-location scenarios where things are unfolding very, very quickly, whether it's light dancing across the landscape or maybe incoming or outgoing weather. Either way, it's a great opportunity to see in real time what some photographers are struggling with or have questions about. And from my experience, when one photographer has a question about something, well, there's probably 1,000 others out there that have the same exact question or concern. And during my Lofoten Islands workshop that just wrapped up, a common question was whether a particular location or a particular composition would look best in a horizontal or a vertical orientation, and how to tell really which route to go. And from what I've been able to gather over the years, many landscape photographers shoot exclusively in a landscape, also known as a horizontal orientation, and rarely ever test out a composition in a portrait, or a vertical orientation. And in this video, I want to shed a bit of light on some deciding factors that many professional photographers think about when on location to help them determine which route to go, whether it's a wide field of view or a tall field of view. Now, to jump right into it, a real quick backstory on the different naming conventions of the two. So this image right here, this is, of course, in a landscape orientation. This is the very first night of that workshop. We were lucky to have the aurora grace us, which was a fantastic way to kick off the entire week. But this is in a landscape orientation, and the specific, the dimensions of the photograph really don't matter. It's considered a landscape orientation anytime that the width is bigger than the actual height of the photograph. And these types of images are generally considered to be much more spacious, to have a greater sense of distance. As you can see, these mountains in the far background, and of course, the little red cabins that we were staying in during the workshop. This photograph feels very grandiose, very spacious, and has a lot of distance to it. These types of photographs also have a lot of additional context. This is also from Norway. There's a ton of context in this overall photograph. It captures the entire area. So landscape orientations really provides a lot of story for the story, a lot of context for the story. So very spacious, has a lot of distance to it, and a ton of context to the overall message that you're trying to deliver. Now, on the opposite side of that, a portrait orientation. These are obviously very popular for portrait photographs, for portrait photographers. And it's considered in a portrait orientation anytime that the height is greater than the width of the photograph. In this orientation is considered to be very grand, or make the subject feel very grand and a very impressive, a much more intimate type of a subject. And it makes the subject feel like it's much closer to you, and it also has less context at the same time. So whenever the subject is closer in the frame, it's going to fill more of the frame, which means it's going to provide less context in the overall photograph. But this type of orientation is very, very popular for photographing humans for those main reasons. Much more grand, makes the person feel more impressive, much more intimate of a photograph as well. Now, back to this photograph here from Norway, I think this is a great example of the difference between the two. So obviously this is in a landscape orientation, and we've already gone over how much distance is in this photograph from this rock in the foreground to these mountains in the background. All the additional context on the left and the right. This image shares the entire scene in its totality. If we come up here to the develop module, I'm going to hit the shortcut key R just to pull up the crop tool. And then I'm going to hit the shortcut key X, and that's going to put us in a portrait crop. And I can slide this anywhere I want. I really like this rock in the foreground here in these trees, so maybe something like that. Although I think that this mountain is way too close to the side, so I'm not a big fan of that right there. So let me just undo this, come back up here, or I could come over here. So for me, the most important part of this overall scene is this mountain right here. This would probably be the most important subject when I was photographing this scene. So if I wanted to put this in a portrait orientation, I could put the mountain right in the center of the scene there. You get this kind of nice sweeping nature of the shoreline here. Plus you have all these red and kind of yellow huts, this whole little city leading up to the mountain here. So something like that I think works as well. And I actually captured this photograph when I was on location as well. And that is this right here. I put on a little bit longer focal length and zoomed in to get a little bit more tighter of a version. And I think you would agree that this in a portrait orientation definitely feels much closer to the overall subject, which is the town leading up to the mountain right here. Had a little bit of light coming through here, which is always nice. It makes this mountain feel much more impressive in a much more intimate scene. And if I go back to the landscape version of this, you'll notice that that mountain seems much smaller. That mountain's not quite as impressive. But this scene offers much more context as well. If I go back to the portrait scene, I think you would agree that this doesn't quite tell the total story either. So you cut off a lot of that context on the left and the right of the photograph versus the landscape scene right here. So I thought that that photograph was an absolutely perfect depiction of the difference between a horizontal orientation versus a portrait orientation. Two completely different versions, tell completely different stories, have completely different feelings, but it's of the same exact location. Now, three things to consider when you're on location, when you're trying to determine, should I go wide or should I go tall for a particular composition? One of the very first things is to think about the overall subject and your subject framing and how you're going to frame that in your composition. So this scene right here is a good example of this. This is from actually an old photo from Maui, and I captured this, of course, in a landscape orientation. Let me hit the shortcut key R and then X. So if I was going to shoot this in a vertical or a portrait orientation, of course, this tree is the main subject. This is the star of the show. This is what I love most about this composition. And if I want to make sure that I fit it in the frame, it would be something like this. And when you look at this photograph, yes, that tree is much more impressive. That tree really stands out. It really pops, but you lose a lot of context around this overall scene. You really can't tell anything that's happening here. You can't really tell what's around this photograph. All that context is gone. So let me just, not zoom in, but let me go back to the crop tool and let's reset this back to landscape mode. And you can see that now you have all of that context. I love this kind of sweeping nature of this mountain and how it kind of mimicked the foreground right through here. And then you have the tree. And this right here provides much, much greater context. And this is another good example in conjunction with the last photograph from Norway of the differences between a landscape and a portrait orientation in that story that it tells. So something else that's really important is, asking yourself, what do you love most about a scene? What do you want to include? What do you want to exclude? And paying attention to what's happening in the background and what's along the sides of your scene is critically important, because that is really going to help tell the story of your overall photograph. So for this particular photograph, of course, this is in a landscape orientation. You get a lot of context to what's going on. Hit the shortcut key R and X. Let's put this in a portrait orientation. Just slide this over just a touch and go with something right there. Now, I think that this works as well, but the Golden Gate Bridge definitely seems much more impressive, much more grandiose. This photograph seems much more intimate, but most importantly, you lose a little bit of that context. Now, that's not saying that that's wrong or right. It's just a completely different feeling. And from my experience, that's one of the most important things to think about when determining landscape or portrait is the context and how intimate you want the image to be, or the story that you're trying to tell. But for me, for this particular image, I liked it a little bit wider. So I think I had it somewhere to, about right there. And I like that because it had a lot of additional story right through here. Now, something else to consider is the overall size. So like right here, this side here doesn't add a lot of value. This side right here doesn't add a lot of value. So one might think, well, maybe you could just crop that off. How important is that to the photograph? Is it really adding anything to that composition? Well, let's try. Shortcut key R, X, put it in portrait, and just kind of slide it over to about right there. And honestly, I think that this looks pretty good. I think that this works. It is a much more intimate version of this pathway right through here. You're not really cutting off anything super, super important, but I think that this version looks good, but I also think it looks good in a wider version as well, because this tells a greater story of the overall scene. You get a greater sense of place as opposed to the portrait composition. So something else that's very important to think about is the way that the image flows, or something I call the optical journey. Now, not every photograph has a very obvious optical journey. This example does right here, where these light rays are just kind of dancing across this valley between these mountains here, and it's clearly going in a left to right or right to left orientation. And if I put this in a vertical crop, something like this, it just doesn't look the same. You completely lose that vertical flow. So paying attention to the existing lines in the overall photograph is very important. Obviously, this one right here, there is a ton of vertical lines, which is one of the reasons why I went in a vertical or a portrait orientation for this particular image. Now, actually, one more example of vertical. Obviously, this waterfall is crashing down, so there is a lot of north to south or top to bottom flow in this, no pun intended there, but in this waterfall. So obviously, that's a very obvious reason to put this in a vertical orientation. And it's one of the reasons why more intimate or closer up versions of waterfalls you almost always see in a portrait orientation. One, because you want to be able to fit the subject in the overall frame. And if you're close to the waterfall, you're probably going to need a taller composition, but also because that optical flow, that journey, it's top to the bottom and it kind of lends itself well to a vertical composition. One more example of this, obviously this water is flowing in this direction, which once again, left to right flow, it's moving in this direction. If we pull up the crop tool and put it in a vertical orientation, maybe we slid it to something like this. I think that this looks okay, but I think it looks much, much better when you get the entire scene because once again, more context, better visual flow, and it's following the natural lines of this photograph. Now, something else to consider when you're trying to determine is how the depth is created in the overall photograph. And from my experience, I find that you can create a greater sense of depth. Now, keep in mind, I personally think that depth and distance are kind of different things. So a mountain in the far, far distance is obviously going to be much further in the scene, but creating a photograph that actually has depth to it seems to be a little bit different in my mind. And I think it lends itself well to using a vertical composition. And this is a good example from a trip many moons ago to West Virginia in the fall. And I think that this photograph has a ton of beautiful depth in it. Good foreground interest here, midground, a nice zigzagging S-curve river, all the way to these beautiful autumn colors in the background. So although the distance between this foreground element and these trees in the background is probably only maybe, I don't know, maybe 30 or 50 yards, which really isn't that far, this photograph has a lot of depth to it. Another good example here where, once again, this area in the background and the bottom of the stairs is probably only about 15 yards. So it's not a great distance, but this image has a lot of depth to it. And I think that this is a great example of that right through there. So paying attention to the depth of a photograph, and keep in mind, and you might think about this a little bit differently, but maybe you look at distance and depth the same way. I kind of think that it's a little bit different between the two things, but just paying attention to how those two things correlate to whether or not you're deciding to go with a landscape or a landscape or a portrait orientation. So back to this image right here, I think this is probably one of the best examples of messaging. And I think that's really one of the last things that not one of the last things, but one of the most important things I think about when I'm on location trying to determine which route I want to go is the message I'm trying to deliver, the feeling I'm trying to convey. And context is everything. Context is king in this particular scenario. So for this particular image, obviously it's in a vertical orientation and everything feels much more grand. The mountain feels much more grand. You can actually see a lot of detail in these houses of this town, especially with this light raking across it. This scene has a lot of context, has a lot of story to it, feels much more intimate. And I think that that's one of the most important aspects, or the most important differentiating factors between a vertical orientation and a horizontal orientation versus this same exact scene in a landscape orientation. As you can notice, this photograph has a ton of additional context around it. Although you don't get the same intimate context, you don't get the same story here, but this has all of it in its totality. This area doesn't feel quite as impressive, doesn't feel as intimate or as grand, but it does tell a completely different story than the portrait orientation does right here. They both tell a story, albeit a little bit differently, but the overall feeling that they portray is completely different. So a couple final thoughts here as far as which route to go. I personally believe that you should photograph in both orientations, but some scenes just don't lend themselves very well to a vertical orientation at all, and some scenes don't lend themselves very well to a landscape orientation. But if the opportunity does present itself to photograph in both orientations, I definitely would. And then give yourself the opportunity when you get back home from your trip to figure out which composition you like best, or maybe to get 2 photographs from one location, which is always a good thing. And then another kind of school of thought, I don't always recommend this, but if you shoot in a landscape orientation, you can always come home and crop it later into a portrait orientation. That is usually a pretty severe crop, But with the high resolution cameras that we most of us have today, it's really not that big of a deal. But you can definitely go either route. Personally, I always try and capture every scene in a landscape and a vertical orientation, and just that way I have both and I can figure it out later when I get home. So I hope that information was helpful. And before I do wrap up this week's video, I just want to say a huge thank you to the longtime sponsor of the channel, which is Squarespace, who I use for all of my website and e-commerce needs. Squarespace provides a dynamic and attractive online platform to create your website. You can display your photography using Squarespace's professional portfolio designs and customize the layout and look and feel of your gallery just so you can make it your own. With Squarespace's traffic overview feature, you can track trends in page visits and views to better optimize your content, and you can even grow and engage with your customers with Squarespace's email campaign tools, which will enable you to create engaging emails that match your website with your products or blog posts and logo, just so your messaging remains consistent. So if you're looking to start a new website or possibly upgrade your current website, check out squarespace.com/Mark Denney for a free trial and 10% off your first purchase. So I hope that information was helpful. Like I said, it was a pretty common question in my most recent workshop is whether or not one should shoot a particular location or a particular composition in a landscape or horizontal orientation versus a portrait or a vertical orientation. And I felt that that would be a fantastic idea to create a video for. So I hope that that did resonate with you. I hope you're able to pick up at least one piece of helpful information out of this week's video that you can apply to your photography moving forward. If you have any questions about anything covered in this week's video, please leave those in the comments section below, and I'll do my best to get back in touch with you as quickly as humanly possible. And if you enjoyed this week's video, if you could give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel if you're not subscribed already. And as always, I really do appreciate you spending a little bit of time with me here today, and I will see you all next Wednesday. Bye.